Our subject this evening is the African origins of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. When we go to the origin of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, most people would think that we would start in Europe because most of our texts teach us that everything began in Greece or either in Rome. But there were many civilizations in Africa that had occurred long before Greece and Rome came into existence. And as a matter of fact, the first scientists were people who came from Central Africa. And one reason that African people were so astute at science, technology, engineering, and mathematics was because of the fact that they were the first to set foot, as Gerald Massey says, on the stage of civilization. And in so doing, they studied not books that we have today in the classroom, but they studied the creation that was already around them. As an example, if they saw an apple fall from a tree, they began to observe this over thousands and thousands of years. So eventually they understood that heavy objects falling to the earth faster produce what we call today as gravity. But when we go into our classrooms, we will be told the story that Isaac Newton was standing under a tree, an apple hit him in the head, and he looked up and said, "Oh, that must be gravity." How absurd. After all the millions of years that apples and coconuts have fallen from trees and have hit people in the head, you're going to tell me that no one knew about gravity until 17th century Europe? No. This is why we have to begin to include other people in our school textbooks and in our teaching. Another example would be if you go back and study the works of Professor Beatrice Lumpkin, who wrote a book, and her book says that in Egypt, which is in Africa, is where the oldest universities and the oldest professors and all the beginnings of everything that we study today in the Western world actually took place. And it was only until the 14th and 15th century, after the Moors had left Africa under the leadership of Tariq ibn Ziyad in 711 AD and went into Spain and Portugal and France and Germany and even went north into Nordic Europe in places like Denmark and Sweden and Norway. They took in the use of science, technology, engineering, mathematics, built the oldest libraries that are known in Europe today were built by dark-skinned people from North Africa who originated in Central Africa, but through migration over the years became the Moors when they came into North Africa. And these Moors were the first to know that the world was round. There was a Moorish scientist by the name of El Idris who wrote a book called The Astronomy of the Earth. And in that book, he says, and I quote him, that the earth is round as a sphere upon which the waters are adherent and maintained upon its surface by natural equilibrium. And then he says that around the earth is a layer of air, which is called the atmosphere. And he says that the earth draws to itself anything that falls in the same way that a magnet attracts iron. So that's gravity. And then there were other North African scholars like Ibn Khaldun, who was the original sociologist long before sociology in the Western textbooks that we know about. So there's no way that we can discuss Western academia and STEM without talking about the engineering of the pyramids, the engineering feat in the building of the pyramids, the mechanics of the pyramids. There's no way that we can do that. And also, this same knowledge now that started in Africa spread into India and China and also even into so-called North America during the time prior to the slave trade. So Africa and its contributions to science, technology, engineering, and mathematics cannot be denied. And we here today in our lecture, we're going to try to become inclusive and to make other people feel good about themselves so that we can understand that they too have made contributions to civilization. Tonight, our topic, ladies and gentlemen, is Martin Luther King, A Life to Emulate. Now, when we study Dr. Martin Luther King, we have to first of all study him in order to emulate him. When we say to emulate, that means to be like, to duplicate, or to design ourselves after. And if we're going to emulate a man like Dr. King, we have to know King before we can emulate King. And in order for us to understand Dr. King, we need to go all the way back down to Atlanta, Georgia, where he lived and where he grew up. And Dr. King was very much influenced by his father, who was called Daddy King. And he talks in his autobiography about how when he and Daddy King went around downtown to shop, and how he and Daddy King had to confront certain white merchants. He said Daddy King always stood up to white people. And he said he, as a young man, recognized that and realized that he would have to always stand up and be a man himself. As a matter of fact, there's an incident that I'll relate to you now that Dr. King said when he was a little boy. The white man tried to call Daddy King a boy. And Daddy King looked at little Martin and said, I'm not a boy, he's a boy. And so Martin said he always remembered that. Because one thing we need to remember, ladies and gentlemen, that is the mind of any child is formed at a very early age. And it can be designed or can be called wet clay. So therefore, everything sticks to that mind in the same way that something sticks to wet clay. So we have to be careful what we're going to put into the minds of the students and into the minds of people that we're teaching, because it's going to have an impact upon them, and it's going to grow and to develop and make them become the people that they're going to become. And we also need to understand Dr. King by recognizing that the Martin Luther King that we know about is not the Martin Luther King that was born here in the United States. He stood on the shoulders of several people on the continent of Africa before he was even born. Dr. King that you saw, 5'5" tall, actually had more under the ground than on top of the ground. It's almost like a tree that you see in the forest or in the woods. There's a certain height to that tree, but the roots of that tree go deep into history. And so when we understand Dr. King, his history goes all the way back to Ethiopia, back to Egypt. He stood on the shoulders of Mansa Musa. Dr. King stood on the shoulders of Asantewa, who kept the Portuguese out of the Congo. Dr. King stood on the shoulders of Shaka, the king of the Zulus, and trying to keep the Dutch out of South Africa. Dr. King had more under the ground than he had on top of the ground. And we also have to understand that before there was a Martin Luther King, there was a Marcus Garvey who had come up out of Jamaica that King studied. And we also have to understand that Martin Luther King studied other cultures and other people. He very seldom quoted from African sources. He would always quote Greek sources. So we today, having more at our disposal than Dr. King had, we should be able to really go further than what he did, because we're so privy to so much material. We're privy to the internet, .org, .com. We have all kinds of books that Dr. King didn't have. Most of Dr. King's sources, if you study them, were basically sources from European theology. He studied Schopenhauer. He studied Dante. But the main thing that made Dr. King become the man that he became is when he studied the little brown man from India. So when we talk about King being African American, and when we talk about Gandhi from India, we have to understand that we have to be inclusive of all other people on the face of the earth, because even in Dr. King's movement, there were people who were lesbian, there were gay people, there were people who were straight, all kinds of people. So we can't leave anyone out when we talk about Dr. King and the civil rights movement. The African oral tradition. What is, Dr. Bruce Bridges, the African oral tradition? The African oral tradition is a tradition that actually spawned rap music. It also is a tradition that all of us came out of. Before things were written, people passed things along, such as the griots in West Africa, passing things down through periods of time and giving it to the children, and it was done in an oral and an unwritten way. And when we look at the African oral tradition, many of the stories, many of the tales, much of the folklore that passed from Africa to America on the slave ships ended up in Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Mississippi, and Alabama, and Virginia. And these tales are tales that were told by African people on the plantations when they got to the end of the line picking cotton. When they got tired of chopping tobacco in the field, they'd get a break. They would tell little stories and entertain themselves. And of course, on Friday nights, in the juke joints of Mississippi, in the liquor houses of Alabama, on the porch with the people playing the banjos and dancing in the holes in the floor, they would tell stories. And these stories are stories that had a message. No one knows the origin of these stories. For example, there's one called Life. It says, life is a funny old proposition from the cradle to the grave. It matters not your calling, be you rich man, woman, beggar, slave. A man comes to birth on this funny old earth without a chance in a million to win, to find that he's through and his funeral is due before he can even begin. He gets one fleeting look at life's sweet mystery book, then the curtain rings down the show. Before he gets set, he finds he's all wet, washed up, and ready to go. Now you'll stumble and strive at this thing called life, but man at his best is but a slave, stumbling at the grind like the rest of his kind before you finally pull up to the grave. For life never stands, and the tightly drawn strands seem to fall apart like sand-woven rope. And the best you can get is a record of debt that you can't even cash in when you're broke. Cause 9/10 of the time, you ain't worth a dime, and life itself ain't nothing but a joke. Now, ladies and gentlemen, faculty and students, that's an example of the African oral tradition. It's not Shakespeare, it's not Sandberg, it's not Longfellow, Shortfellow, it's not these writers, Edna St. Vincent Millay, it's not Wordsworth and Wadsworth, but it's still poetry that came from people who came to America as slaves and who were passing along their traditions. And to the ladies in the audience, there's a very good piece of poetry that's called A Toast, and it's called Woman is the doggonest of all contradictions. She's a demon of truth and an angel of fiction. She's afraid of a little bit old cockroach, and she'll scream at a mouse. But she'll jump on her husband, even if he's big as a house. Now you can take her for better, or you can take her for worse. She'll split your head wide open, and then turn around and be your nurse. Now you might know how to predict the weather, and you may know when the sun's gonna shine, but ain't no man knows when a woman is gonna change her mind. So these are the kinds of things that come out of the African oral tradition. And in academia, when you teach poetry, and when you teach literature, when you teach iambic pentameter, and when you teach onomatopoeia and all other techniques of poetry, you have to understand that Langston Hughes said many years ago, black people, a crust of bread is all we needed, and a corner to sleep in, a minute to laugh, and a whole hour to weep in, a pint of joy to a peck of trouble, and never to laugh that the moans come double, and that's life. What is hazing? Where did hazing come from? Why do fraternities and sororities haze? Why are there many students on college campuses around the world today, black college campuses, white college campuses, who injure themselves, and even some who are killed, such as the drum major at Florida A&M University, from hazing? What is hazing? Why is it done? Hazing is a technique of humiliation of the human form when a man or woman is online trying to become a delta, trying to become an alpha, trying to become a kappa, trying to become a sigma, trying to become something to be a part of an organization. When actually, if a person knows himself or a student knows herself, they would recognize that they don't have to be a part of an organization, and they would be more respected if they could stand alone. But since we know that that's not the case, and many of us are going to become members of fraternities and sororities. And you're going to become members of these organizations on your campus that do a lot of good. I think you should know what they're all about. Hazing is when something is done to a person online physically. But from the beginning, hazing was not physical, but it was mental when students began to go into fraternities and sororities. In ancient Ethiopia, they had in the endogamous and the exogamous societies something called phratries, P-H-R-A-T-R-I-E-S, from which you get the word fraternity. And they also had women who were in sisterhoods, and those women in sisterhoods stayed to themselves, and the men in brotherhoods stayed to themselves. The whole process of becoming a member of a fraternity and a sorority in ancient African societies was a mental thing. People had to show themselves to be astute in the sciences, in the arts, and to grow themselves up mentally. But when you look at the history of Greece and Rome, where hazing actually originated, what was a mental thing and a spiritual thing, it became physical. When you look on the vases of Greek pottery, when you look on the vases and the symbols of the Greeks and the Romans, most times you will see them naked and not wearing clothing, because when we study hazing, we find that it also can be traced back to the Olympics. When men and women were preparing themselves for the Olympics, they would have to put the shot, they'd have to run track, they would have to wrestle, and they would have to build up the human body. And when the human body was being built up, they neglected the mental and the spiritual. But they got it from ancient Egypt, but then it was turned around and became something else. And this haze